getting to be a real sick problem with people that's constantly trying to use us as some political football.
And there's not going to be no without gentlemen, with all due respect. Definitely not going to be any without. I would like that to be clear for the record. I understand the fact that we got police in here. I wanted you to be here to understand what I said.
Jeff Fort was a very powerful human being.
There are American gangs, and then there are American gangs that scared everyone, including the police. The Blackstone Rangers, or Blackstone Nation, was one of those. Under the leadership of Jeff Fort, this gang developed such a scary reputation that even the police was rumored to be afraid of them.
The Nation is a federation of 30 Chicago gangs. They're called Rangers, and there's an estimated 5,000 of them. They may have as many guns as the entire Chicago Police Department.
They were more powerful than the police. I tell you the truth about it.
I can tell you one thing for sure. These guys definitely weren't playing. They were really about that life. Jeff Fort was that gang leader that had such an aura that, depending on who you asked, was either an angel or the devil himself. Perhaps that's why his nickname fitted him quite well. He was known as the Angel of Fear. I mean, this guy built up such a legend that there were even stories of how he used his pet lion to off his enemies. Now that's cold. This is a really juicy one, guys. Let's dig into it.
For a man not to have no formal education and could lead that many people and run that many people's lives, I would have to say he's wise.
Jeff Fort, also known as Abdul Malik Kaaba, lived what you can call a complete criminal life. This was a guy who embraced gang culture and violence fully, enjoyed the power it got him, and eventually aligned himself with terrorism from outside the country. Born in Chicago, Illinois, Fort's early days laid the foundation for what would become one of the most dangerous and influential criminal empires in the city's history. Up till now, Fort is still in prison, but his influence on Chicago's gang landscape during the late 20th century is undeniable. This was a young man from the south side of Chicago who became the leader of a notorious gang, an architect of violence, and later, a convicted terrorist.
It's a very violent situation. I mean, shooting and stabbings going on continually in that community.
Back in 1965, when Jeff Fort was just 18 years old, he teamed up with his associate Eugene Hairston to form what would later become one of the most infamous street gangs in Chicago. They called it the Blackstone Rangers, and at first it was mostly made up of young boys, some as young as 9 years old and others in their late teens, up to around 18. These kids were involved in the kind of small-time crimes you'd expect from a group that young. Things like snatching purses, breaking into local stores, and getting into street fights with rival gangs. It was disorganized and chaotic, with no real structure beyond who was toughest or most daring on a given day.
First encountered them, they were a group of very young kids, maybe 16, 17 years old, the leadership. They were involved in violence.
But all that changed when Jeff Fort started to rise as a leader. What began as a loose collection of restless youth quickly turned into something much more organized and dangerous under his watchful eye. Fort had a vision for the Blackstone Rangers, and he took them from being just another group of kids on the street to becoming a tightly run operation with a solid hierarchy and clear goals.
There would be a ruling council called the Main 21 and a new gang name, the Blackstone Nation. Some said the P stood for power. That nation was 4,000 strong, but in the end, Jeff Fort would emerge as the man in charge.
By 1967, just 2 years after the gang's humble beginnings, the Blackstone Rangers underwent a transformation. They rebranded themselves as the Black P Stones, signaling a shift from being a single gang to becoming a coalition of 21 different street gangs from across Chicago. Each of these gangs had its own leader, but there was no doubt about who held the real power. Jeff sat at the top of the chain of command, leading what became known as the Main 21, a council made up of the leaders of these various gangs, all of whom reported directly to him.
But the Egyptian Cobras couldn't beat the Blackstone Rangers, and if you couldn't beat them, in order to survive, you had to join. Ultimately, 21 gangs would join under the umbrella of the Blackstone Rangers.
This setup gave Fort an extraordinary amount of influence. He wasn't just running a single gang anymore, he was controlling an entire network of street gangs, each with its own members and operations. Altogether, this gave him command over roughly 10,000 gang members, making him one of the most powerful and feared figures in Chicago's criminal underworld. This level of power was unheard of at the time, and Fort's ability to unite these gangs under his leadership made him a formidable force in the city's ongoing gang wars.
There were 8 disciples shot on that corner in that year.
On this corner here, 65th and Woodlawn.
This was the Gaza Strip, and
This was the Gaza Strip?
As the leader of the Black Pea Stones, Jeff Fort quickly found himself right in the thick of Chicago's gang wars, particularly with one of their fiercest rivals, the Disciples, led by David Barksdale. The tension between the Pea Stones and the Disciples was constantly simmering, and by the late 1960s, things had boiled over to the point where violence between the two gangs was spiraling out of control. Both sides were deeply entrenched in their rivalry, and the constant clashes on the streets were making it clear that neither group was backing down anytime soon. In an effort to bring some kind of resolution to the chaos, Fort and Barksdale decided to meet face to face to talk about the possibility of a truce. It seemed like a good idea after all. With so much bloodshed, maybe peace would be the best option for everyone. But despite their meeting, nothing productive came from it. The bad blood between the Pea Stones and the Disciples ran too deep, and both sides had suffered too many losses for any real progress to be made. The animosity between the two gangs was simply too intense to overcome with a single conversation, and it became clear that peace was a long shot.
what we found out was that Jeff and the main 21, they did very little of the dirty work. They usually put the 12, 13, 14-year-olds up to do the shooting and those kinds of things, because it was very unlikely that they would go to jail.
Not long after that failed attempt at negotiations, the violence took another dark turn when someone made an attempt on David Barksdale's life. The hit didn't go as planned though, because while the police were able to arrest 3 teenagers who were involved in the attack, Barksdale managed to survive. But instead of calming things down, this assassination attempt only fueled the fire, and the cycle of violence between the Pea Stones and the Disciples raged on, with no end in sight. By 1968, the south side of Chicago was completely overwhelmed by a surge of gang violence, with tensions reaching a boiling point. The sheer scale of the chaos was staggering. Just that year alone, over 30 people lost their lives due to gang-related incidents. Things had gotten so bad that even the federal government couldn't ignore what was happening. Concerned by the escalating violence, officials launched an investigation to see if there was any connection between this criminal activity and government funds that were meant to help the community. At the heart of this inquiry was a $900,000 federal grant that was supposed to be used for job training programs aimed at giving young people in the area a chance at a better life. But instead of uplifting the community, there were whispers and allegations that this money was somehow finding its way into the hands of the Black Pea Stones, a gang that was quickly becoming more organized and dangerous under the leadership of Jeff Fort. People began to suspect that the grant, meant to offer job skills and a future to local youth, was instead being used to fuel the gang's illegal activities.
They were in it for the money and whatever other gains could be gotten.
As the investigation deepened, several members of the Black Pea Stones were brought in to testify before a Senate subcommittee to answer questions about the gang's operations and its potential misuse of federal funds. It was during this time that a high-ranking member of the gang, George, made the decision to turn against the group and cooperate with the authorities. He revealed some damning information, admitting that the gang had been stockpiling weapons and that the leaders were receiving kickbacks from the job training program that was supposed to benefit the community. His testimony was a bombshell, exposing how the Black Pea Stones were not just running the streets, but also manipulating government funds to finance their activities. However, when it came time for Jeff Fort to testify, he had no intention of playing along. Instead of answering any of the questions or providing information, Fort made it clear that he wasn't going to cooperate. He walked into the hearing, casually stated his name, and then walked right back out, defying the entire process. His refusal to testify led to him being charged with contempt of Congress, adding yet another layer of legal trouble to his already complex situation.
Will you state your name, please?
Jeff Fort.
Meanwhile, the violence between the Black Pea Stones and their rivals, the Disciples, continued to rage on without any sign of slowing down. The Chicago Police Department, realizing how out of control things were getting, decided to ramp up their efforts to combat the gangs. The number of officers assigned to the gang intelligence unit was increased significantly, going from just 38 officers to a whopping 200. Their goal was to crack down on the gang violence and restore some order to the streets. As part of this crackdown, Jeff Fort, along with 60 other members of the Black P. Stones was arrested. They were charged with mob action and disorderly conduct, signaling a clear attempt by law enforcement to get a handle on the situation. But even with these arrests, the larger issue of gang violence remained far from resolved, and the south side of Chicago was still in the grips of an ongoing war between rival gangs, with no easy solution in sight. In a pretty unexpected twist, Jeff Fort actually received an invitation to attend President Richard Nixon's inauguration in 1969. This move caused quite a stir, especially among law enforcement officials who saw it as an insult, considering Fort's deep involvement in criminal activity. It felt like a slap in the face to them that someone like Fort, who had such a notorious reputation, would be invited to such a prestigious event.
Hoodlum him off the corner and invite him to the White House? You desecrate the White House. I think it's absolutely outrageous.
However, instead of accepting the invitation and showing up in person, Fort decided to decline it. He didn't go himself, but instead sent one of his gang associates to attend the ceremony on his behalf. Meanwhile, things within the Black P. Stones were far from peaceful. Tensions were rising not only with rival gangs, but even within Fort's own ranks. Fort became increasingly paranoid, fearing for his life as threats seemed to be coming from all directions. He was especially worried about the Black Panthers and the East Side Disciples, two groups he saw as major threats. To stay safe, Fort started moving around with more security, trying to protect himself from any possible attacks. But even with all these precautions in place, he couldn't avoid trouble. In 1969, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison, although the charges that landed him behind bars weren't directly related to his gang activities. While Fort was serving his sentence, things within the Black P. Stones took a turn for the worse. Internal strife that had been simmering for a while began to spill out into the open, leading to some violent and deadly confrontations. One of the most notable incidents involved Paul, a high-ranking member of the gang who decided to publicly cut ties with the Black P. Stones. Paul claimed that Fort had threatened his life, which sent shockwaves through the gang. Not long after Paul made his announcement, he was offed, which only fueled speculation that Fort had ordered the hit to silence him. This wasn't the only emder that rocked the Black P. Stones during this time. Several other K-ings occurred as well, all seemingly tied to internal power struggles and infighting. One particularly gruesome event was the emder of Lawrence, a 23-year-old former gang member who had decided to leave the Black P. Stones behind. Lawrence's decision to leave didn't sit well with the gang, and he ended up paying for it with his life. His body was found with multiple gunshot wounds to the face, a brutal reminder of how dangerous it was to walk away from the gang. His wife later told the police that Lawrence had been targeted specifically because he had chosen to leave the gang, showing just how high the stakes were for anyone who tried to break free from the Black P. Stones' grip during this violent and turbulent time. As law enforcement intensified their efforts to finally capture Jeff Fort, they started closing in on him, though not directly at first. Since Fort himself was proving difficult to locate, the police decided to keep a close eye on his girlfriend Janice. This decision ended up being a smart move because during their surveillance, they caught her buying a plane ticket to New York. That gave them the break they needed. Detectives tailed Janice all the way to her hotel in Manhattan, where they moved in and arrested not only her but also Fort, who was with her at the time, along with another gang member who was already wanted for questioning in connection to a double emder case. When police searched the hotel room where Fort was staying, they found quite a bit of interesting evidence. Along with a large stash of cash, they uncovered passports that suggested Fort had been doing some international travel. One of his trips even included a visit to Barbados. On top of that, it seemed like Fort had been plotting an even bigger escape plan. Authorities believed he was preparing to flee to Canada and then eventually to Algeria, where a few of his associates had already set up base. Following his arrest in New York, Fort was quickly extradited back to Chicago to face multiple charges, one of the most prominent being contempt of Congress. His bail was set at a whopping $800,000, a clear indication of the seriousness of the charges he was up against. Despite all this, Fort still managed to avoid being locked up for the long term right away, continuing to slip through the cracks of the justice system, at least for a little while longer. After Fort was released from prison, he made some major changes to his organization. The Black P. Stones, which had already evolved over the years, went through yet another transformation, this time rebranding as Rukn. This new faction followed a much more religious and militarized ideology under Fort's guidance, creating a clear divide within the gang. On one side, there were those who stayed loyal to the Black P. Stones, and on the other, those who decided to follow Fort into this new chapter as Rukn.
People
His followers would be called the El Rukns. Jeff Fort would now be called both Angel and Imam.
Tell you about what was going on. They had a brotherhood. They were very loyal to one another.
We're not a gang, and a person just can't join us.
El Rukn, with Fort at the helm, became far more organized and, as a result, even more dangerous. Their criminal activities ramped up, becoming more violent and calculated than ever before. This caught the attention of law enforcement, who were growing increasingly concerned about what the gang was up to. In 1979, things escalated when police carried out a raid on one of El Rukn's key headquarters. During the raid, they arrested several gang members and seized a serious stockpile of weapons, giving authorities a glimpse into just how heavily armed and prepared El Rukn had become under Fort's leadership. In the early 1980s, Fort's criminal empire took a much darker and more dangerous path. El Rukn, which had already established itself as a powerful and violent gang, started getting involved in international terrorism. They forged connections with the Libyan government under Muammar Gaddafi, which was a shocking development for both law enforcement and the general public. Fort, along with several other gang members, was accused of plotting terrorist attacks in the US on behalf of Libya in exchange for a staggering $2.5 million. This marked a turning point for the gang, pushing their criminal activities to a whole new level. Federal agents were quick to act, conducting multiple raids on El Rukn's facilities. During these raids, they uncovered a cache of weapons that were sophisticated enough to penetrate military tanks, signaling just how serious and dangerous El Rukn had become.
It's had an informant who told us that there were two 45 semi-automatic machine guns, that they had been altered from semi-automatic to fully automatic.
On top of that, investigators found clear evidence that Fort had been in direct communication with Libyan officials, working out the details of these terrorist plots. Wiretaps and recordings of conversations between Fort and his associates provided all the proof needed to link them directly to the conspiracy, leaving little room for doubt.
Secret recordings of Jeff Fort's telephone conversations with an Aberdeen drug dealer turned government informant. The pay telephone became Jeff Fort's instrument of power.
Yeah, ain't no problem. That ain't no problem. Our thing is that it's not no waste type thing like one can't draw.
By 1987, Fort's criminal reign came crashing down. He was convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit terrorism, and sentenced to 80 years in federal prison. This conviction not only sealed Fort's fate, but also led to the downfall of El Rukn as a major criminal organization. Many of the gang's members were arrested, and the once feared group was essentially dismantled, marking the end of an era for both Fort and the gang he had built. Jeff Fort's story is one of tragedy, power, and ultimately, self-destruction. He rose from the streets of Chicago to become one of the most feared gang leaders in the city's history. Under his leadership, the Blackstones and later El Rukn grew into a powerful force, but his descent into terrorism ensured that his legacy would be one of infamy. While Fort remains behind bars, his influence on Chicago's gang culture continues to be felt. The gangs that splintered off from the Blackstones and El Rukn are still active in some form today, and the cycle of violence that he helped perpetuate continues to impact the city. In the end, Jeff Fort's life serves as a cautionary tale of how power can corrupt and how a desire for control can lead to one's downfall. From the south side of Chicago to the halls of federal courtrooms and beyond, Fort's journey is a stark reminder of the complexities of gang culture and the far-reaching consequences of unchecked violence.